Okay, once again, we are recording for the sake of putting this up on YouTube because of the weather. We don't know really for sure what the weather is going to do tonight, but it sounds like just about the time class would be starting is when the weather is going to come through, and it looks like there might be ice involved. If it was just snow, it probably would go ahead and have class anyhow, but since we can do this and we can do the videos and get them out there for everybody to see, I figured there's no sense putting anybody at risk. So we're going to do the recordings, and just like last week, we're going to do 4 sessions, each about 25 minutes long. And so those of you who are taking the class for credit, you'll want to watch all 4 sessions. And so I think last week's were lectures 11 through 14. This will be lectures 15 through 18. So make sure you watch all 4 of those 25-minute lectures. That's the plan here. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and I want to begin looking at the first 8 verses. But before I read those verses, I want to point out here that Paul has just finished chapter 4 by saying that he was hard pressed on every side. He was, but not crushed. He was perplexed, but not in despair. He was persecuted, but not forsaken. He was struck down, but not destroyed. And he referred to his constant troubles. Despite all that, he referred to them as momentary light affliction. And Paul no doubt had his share of trials, but when we get to chapter 5 in particular, even in chapter 4, we don't see Paul cowering in a corner somewhere. Instead, we see Paul being very courageous. And so particularly in verses 6 and 8 here, my New King James says we are confident. Verse 6, we are always confident. Verse 8, we are confident, yes. And that idea there of confident, the Greek word here can certainly be translated confidence, but it really has the idea of courage. And so I call this section Cause for Courage. In fact, a number of translations will render it, we are of good courage. Rather than saying we're confident, they say we're of good courage. So the question is, how is it possible to have confidence or even courage in such trials? I really think this is one of those places where maybe it wasn't a good place to make a chapter break. Probably chapter 4 verses 16 should go together with chapter 5 verses 1 through 8 because it's kind of continuing on that same thought, and that those things maybe ought to be read together. So at the end of chapter 4, Paul is saying that the inward man is being renewed day by day. And he's saying that these things are working for us an eternal weight of glory. And he says we're looking at eternal things that are not seen. And then in chapter 5, he continues his thought about these things. And that is his thoughts about the renewal of the inner man, the glory that is ours in eternity, and the eternal things that are not seen. And it's these things that gives Paul the courage to face trials. So here, Paul gives 3 causes for courage. And so I'm going to tell you what those are, and then we'll read the passage. First of all, an edifice. Second of all, an eagerness. That word edifice, by the way, means building. And then thirdly, an earnest. And that's the earnest of the Spirit. So let's read the passage here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1. For we know, and you can see there the connection with the previous statements in the end of chapter 4, that if our earthly house, this tent, and he's talking about our physical body there, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven. I want you to just notice a couple things right off the bat. He's talking about the body we have now, and he refers to it as earthly, and he refers to it as a tent and something that's going to be destroyed. But what we have from God is not just a tent, it's a building, far more permanent. He calls it a house. It's not made with hands, and it's eternal. For in this, he says, we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven, if indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. And here he's talking about without a body. For we know we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, that is, not that we want to be without a body, but further clothed. We want a different body, the body that God's prepared for us in heaven. That mortality may be swallowed up by life. And this is very similar to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which we'll look at before we're done here. I think you have to study those passages together. And, of course, Paul's writing this to the Corinthians. They would have been familiar with what he'd written in 1 Corinthians 15 because that he wrote to them. Now, he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has also given us the Spirit as a guarantee, or earnest is the idea there. So we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, yes, well pleased rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Now, as I said, there's three things here that gives Paul courage, and the first one is an edifice, that is a building. And Paul actually uses two metaphors here to refer to our resurrected body in these first four verses, and the one is that of a building. He talks about a tent or a house versus a tent versus a house, I should say, and the building that we have from God. But then also that of a garment, talking about being clothed or unclothed or being further clothed. And so he's using the metaphor here of a building. He's also using the metaphor of a garment. And he refers to our physical body as a tent or a tabernacle in both verses 1 and 5 here. He's talking about it as a tent or a tabernacle. This is a temporary structure. It's not something that is permanent. And so in contrast to this, Paul speaks about, when he talks about our glorified body, our resurrected body, he talks about something much more permanent, a building or a house. And so it's like comparing the tabernacle that they had under Moses, which was a temporary structure, and it was built to be portable, and they could tear it down, and they could move it, and they could set it back up. And it was really essentially a tent compared to the temple, say the Temple of Solomon, or even the temple in Jesus' day, which is sometimes called Herod's temple, but the idea that was a permanent structure that was fixed. And so Paul's contrasting here the temporary nature of the body that we have now with the permanent structure of the body that God is preparing for us. And in fact, he calls this structure, he says it's a house in verse 1, not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And so it's not some kind of, he's not talking about some kind of intermediate body that we receive at death. He's actually talking about some new body that we're going to receive at the resurrection that is in fact going to be permanent. Now I want to turn here to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I'm not going to take the time to read this entire chapter, but I think it's well worth your time to do so. But I'm just going to read parts of this, starting in verse 35, where Paul is talking about the resurrection of the dead, and he's talking about that in fact we are going to be raised from the dead, and that when that happens, and it's going to happen at the last trumpet, when that happens, we are going to receive a new body. And so he says in verse 35, somebody will say, and he's anticipating this objection to the idea of a resurrection, how are the dead raised up, and with what body do they come? And Paul says, foolish one, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies, and what you sow, you do not sow that body that shall be, but mere grain, perhaps wheat or some other grain, but God gives it a new body, as he pleases, and to each seed its own body. And he goes in this discussion about glory, different types of flesh and different types of glory and so on. But he says in verse 42, so also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption. When our body dies, it's corrupted, it's falling apart. One guy said it this way, when you look at a corpse, you're looking at failed biology. Maybe that's one way to put it, but the point is that this body is sown in corruption, but it's raised in incorruption. It's sown in dishonor, but it's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness, that's why you died. It's raised in power. It's sown a natural body, physical, but it's raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body, and there is a spiritual body. And he goes on with this discussion, and he makes it clear that this is going to happen at the end of the world, at the last trumpet. So here's what he says in verse 51. I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, when? At the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. And then he goes on, when this happens, when this corruptible puts on incorruption, in other words, when we receive our resurrected body, and this mortal is put on immortality, then will be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where's your sting? O Hades, where's your victory? Okay, so there's more that we could read there, but you kind of get the idea. And the point I'm trying to make is that what Paul is talking about here, this new body, this new house, that we're going to receive that's eternal in the heavens, that happens at the resurrection. That's what Paul ultimately is looking towards here, is the resurrection. But then he talks about his desire is not to be unclothed, but to be further clothed. And so it's not that intermediate state. He's not looking, what he's looking forward to, and where his hope is not so much in his death as it is in his resurrection, but death is a necessary step towards the resurrection. Unless, of course, we're alive when the Lord returns. We're all going to die, and that's a step in the process towards ultimately our resurrection when we receive this new body. So my point here for now is that we receive this new body at the resurrection, which happens at the last trumpet, and it's only then that we receive that new body. Now, somebody wants to know, I'm sure, well, what's that new body going to be like? And when I was younger, I always used to kind of sort of kid around and say, well, I don't know for sure, but I know that the new body I get is going to be tall, and it's going to be dark, and it's going to be handsome. And of course, I don't know any of that. But what I do know is that it's going to be incorruptible, and it's going to be spiritual, and it's going to be immortal. But we don't know much more than that because we're specifically told that we don't know much more than that. In 1 John chapter 3, in verses 1 and 2, John says, behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed on us that we should be called children of God. Therefore, the world does not know us because it did not know him. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not yet been revealed what we shall be. We don't know yet what that resurrected body really is going to be, but we know that when he, that's Jesus, is revealed, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And this Jesus being revealed, that's talking about his return at the last trumpet, and that when he's revealed, we'll be like him. So whatever we're going to be changed to is we'll be like Jesus in that regard, in a glorified body. And we'll see him as he is. But right now it's not been revealed to us what that new body is going to be like. But we know that it's going to be immortal. We know it's going to be incorruptible. We know it's going to be spiritual. And so he uses this metaphor of a building to make that point, but he also uses the metaphor of a garment or clothing in order to describe this. And he says, we desire to be further clothed with this habitation or dwelling from heaven. And that's in verse 4 here. We're in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed. It's not that I want to be a disembodied spirit, but that I want to be further clothed. I want to receive that resurrected body. I want to receive that glorified body. But I want to be further clothed that mortality may be swallowed up by life. And so Paul had referred to this tent as an earthly house, but what is yet to come is heavenly. Our present bodies are just dust, clay, dirt, whatever expression you want to use to describe that, that's what they are. But what we are going to receive is not earthly, it's heavenly. So there's that contrast there between the earthly body and the heavenly body. The body we have now is earthly. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We came from the dust to dust where we're going to return. That's what's going to happen to this body. But the new body is not earthly, it is heavenly. And he contrasts being clothed with being naked or unclothed. And so that is, he's talking about with a body as opposed to without a body. So Paul, his desire here is not to be unclothed. That's what he's saying in verse 4. It's not to be without a body, but he wants to be further clothed, and that is with his glorious body, with his resurrected body. So, and that happens when mortality, and when that happens, that's when mortality is swallowed up by life. Now you notice that's very, very similar language to what he used in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that we read a little bit here. So Paul's already talked to him about this very thing, that at the resurrection, this mortal puts on immortality, and what's sown in dishonor is raised in glory, and all that sort of thing here. Same kind of idea that he's got here. So what Paul was looking forward to was not death, it was the resurrection. That's what he's looking forward to, because that's ultimately our moment of victory as Christians. Now, sometimes we speak about death as though it's our moment of victory, but and it sort of is in a sense, in that we leave this world behind and we go to a place of comfort called paradise. But ultimately, our victory is in the resurrection, not in our death. And that's what Paul's looking forward to here. Now, the Greeks didn't like the idea of resurrection. You remember that when Paul was on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, in there in Acts chapter 17, and he's talking to all these Greeks, and most of them were sort of moved by Greek philosophy. They didn't like it when he started talking about the resurrection. In fact, I just want to read a little bit there from Acts chapter 17, and beginning in verse 18, Paul says this. He says, where Luke tells us, certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, that's Paul, and some said, what does this babbler have to say? Now that word babbler there is literally a seed picker. And it was used of people who would just go around picking up little scraps of knowledge here and there and then trying to spread it around as though it was their own, and so on. What does this babbler want to say? Others said he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, and the reason they said that is because he preached the resurrection, preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. And so their idea of resurrection was like foreign gods. There's more that can be said about that. I'm not going to take the time to talk about that here, but that's an interesting thing in and of itself. But the resurrection is what was really kind of threw them off. But then if you drop down to verse 30, where Paul says, truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he's appointed a day on which he'll judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. That's Jesus, of course. He's given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, while others said, we'll hear you again on this matter. And Paul didn't have a lot of converts there. We do have some mentioned here in verse 34, but he's speaking to Greeks. The Greeks didn't like the idea of a resurrection. This is pretty well known about the Greeks. They viewed our body as a prison, and they sort of viewed mankind as we're like a spirit that's trapped in this prison of our body, and they thought it would be a glorious thing if we could set the spirit free from this body. In other words, they wanted to be unclothed. Paul says, I don't want to be unclothed. I want to be further clothed. But the Greeks, they thought it was a good idea to be unclothed. And they couldn't understand, the Greeks couldn't, why anybody would want to be back in a body after escaping it in death. They thought, well, death is a great escape from your body. Why in the world would you want to resurrect the body and be back in your body again? Which is probably why there was so much trouble about the resurrection at the Corinthian church. So the Greeks would say things like, well, the body is a tomb. And one of their philosophers was actually said he was ashamed that he had a body. And another one of their philosophers said that he was a poor soul burdened with a corpse. Seneca actually said, I am a higher being and am born for higher things than to be a slave of my body, which I look upon as only a shackle put upon my freedom. In so detestable a habitation dwells the free soul. So the Greeks had a very low estimation of the body and of any value of the body, which is kind of ironic in a way, because they were the first ones that really, to the kind of level that they did, glorified the body in things like sculpture and art and so on and so forth, and yet their view of the body was such a low idea. But even when we sing our hymn, our more of a praise chorus, I guess you might call it, but a song I really enjoy called "I'll Fly Away," right? We've got the line in that song that says, like a bird from prison bars has flown, and it's talking about our death. And I think it may have been influenced to some extent, the hymn writer might have been, by this Greek notion of our body as a prison. Now, just to be clear here, so I'm not misunderstood, the book of Psalms in chapter 90 and verse 10 does speak about our death as a time in which we fly away. So I'm not knocking the idea of flying away. I'm just simply saying that one particular line in the song where we talk about that, like a bird from prison bars has flown, might have in fact have been influenced by this concept of the Greeks that you're going to escape from your body, this prison of your body, in death. And that's not what I'm saying to you is that's not a biblical concept. That's a Greek concept. And Paul is actually refuting that, and he says, my goal is not to be unclothed. It's not that I want to be without a body, but that I want to be further clothed. I want to be clothed with my resurrected body, my glorified body. And that was not a concept that the Greeks had at all. Well, even some of the Corinthians had doubted the resurrection. And we can read this again in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's a long chapter. Let me just give you a brief summary of that chapter. If you look at if you look verses 12 through 14, there were people there who were claiming there was no resurrection of the dead. And so that's why Paul wrote that 15th chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians. And they were probably influenced by Greek thinking. And in the first 11 verses of that chapter, Paul shows, first of all, there's ample evidence of the resurrection of Christ. And he makes it clear that that's crucial to our faith, that in fact is of first importance, and what we call the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He lays out the fact there's ample evidence of it. He was seen by more than 500 brethren at one time. And then in verses 12 through 34, he shows how foolish it is to deny the idea of the resurrection. And then in verses 35 through 50, he explains that we have a resurrected body that we're going to have. We don't have it now, but we're going to have that. And then he explains what's going to happen to those who are still living when Christ returns in verses 51 through 54. And then he lays out the implications of the resurrection in verses 55 through 58. And so you can see here where Paul is dealing with this idea and showing to the Corinthians that there is a resurrection. We do get a resurrected body. And what Paul's saying here in this passage is he's not looking for or anxious for some kind of bodiless eternity, but he's looking for that glorified body. That's what he wants. And so Paul doesn't just, the point in this passage is, Paul doesn't just teach the resurrection like he did in 1 Corinthians 15, but he believed it, and he lived like he believed it. That's why he was able to say what he did in chapter 4 about this is just momentary light affliction, and talk about the eternal weight of glory that it was working in us. But I'll point out one final thing about that before I leave this topic, and then we'll take a little break here. And that is that even the demons desire to have a body. And so what I'm saying to you is that the Greeks had this idea they'd be better off without a body. Paul didn't believe that. Even the demons didn't believe that. Look at Matthew chapter 12. We'll just do this real quick before we take a break. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 43, Jesus says, when an unclean spirit, that's a demon, goes out of a man, he goes through dry places seeking rest and finds none. Then he says, I'll return to my house from which I came, that is the body that I inhabited. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. And then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits, more wicked than himself. And they enter and dwell there, and the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it be with this wicked generation. And it's not just that passage, but when Jesus cast the demons out of the Gadarene demoniac, they said to him, can we go into the swine, the pigs? And Jesus allowed them to go into the pigs, and they did. So My point is that the Greeks thought it's a good thing to escape from the body, and Paul says, no, no, no. That's not the point here. The point's not escaping from my body. The point is making it to my resurrected body. And even the demons understood that. So our inward man is being renewed day by day, but the outward man is being destroyed. But when the outward man is finally renewed, which happens at the resurrection, that's when God's work in us will be complete. And Romans 8 talks about that as well. We'll look at that real quick when we come back from break. But I want you to understand that the body we're looking forward to is a heavenly body as opposed to this earthly one. And that's a great cause to have courage. So let's take a little break and we'll come back.